The morning of November 11th dawned gray and somber over London, with clouds hanging low like a blanket of memory over the city. Prince William stood at the window of Kensington Palace, watching the early commuters hurry past, their breath visible. In the crisp autumn air, today would be different from any other Remembrance Day he had experienced as a senior member of the royal family. Catherine entered the room quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. She had been awake for hours, unable to shake the weight of what lay ahead. The previous evening they had received a letter that would change everything about their planned tribute. It came from Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an 89-year-old woman from Yorkshire, whose grandfather had served in the trenches of the Somme and whose father had stormed the beaches of Normandy. "I've been thinking about what she wrote," Catherine said, softly handing William his tea. The letter lay open on the desk between them, its words having kept them both restless through the night. Mrs. Hartwell had shared a story that neither of them quite ignore, a story about her family's secret that had been buried for over 70 years. William picked up the letter again, reading aloud the passage that had moved them both to tears. Mrs. Hartwell wrote about finding a hidden collection of letters in her late father's belongings. Letters that revealed he had saved the life of a German soldier during the Battle of Arnhem, only to discover years later that the same soldier had gone on to save dozens of Allied prisoners. The 2 men had corresponded secretly for decades after the war, becoming unlikely friends bound by the strange twist of fate that had brought them together in humanity's darkest hour. The palace staff had initially dismissed the letter as one of thousands they received each year. But something about Mrs. Hartwell's careful handwriting and the accompanying photograph had caught Catherine's attention. The black and white image showed 2 elderly men sitting on a park bench feeding pigeons, their faces marked by age, but their eyes bright with warmth and understanding. On the back, someone had written, "Harold Hartwell and Klaus Weber, London, 1985, friends, despite history." Catherine had spent days researching Mrs. Hartwell's story, reaching out to military historians and archivists. What she discovered was remarkable. Harold Hartwell had indeed served with distinction, and Klaus Weber had not only survived the war, but had spent his remaining years working with organizations that promoted peace between former enemies. Their friendship had lasted until Harold's death in 1987. Yet Mrs. Hartwell had only discovered this extraordinary chapter of her father's life when she found his private papers. As William finished reading, he looked up at Catherine with determination in his eyes. "We have to do something with this," he said. "This isn't just about one family's story. This is about what remembrance really means." The traditional ceremony at the cenotaph would proceed as planned, with its time-honored rituals and solemn dignity. But William and Catherine had decided to add something unprecedented to their tribute, something that would honor not just the fallen, but the living. Legacy of reconciliation and hope that could emerge from the ashes of conflict. They had arranged to meet Mrs. Hartwell that afternoon. Before the evening vigil, they had planned at Westminster Abbey. The meeting would be private, away from the cameras and protocol that usually surrounded their public appearances. Catherine had insisted on this. She wanted to hear the full story directly from the woman who had uncovered this hidden chapter of history. As the morning progressed, William found himself thinking about his own family's connection to the wars that had shaped the modern world. His great-grandfather, King George VI, had remained in London during the Blitz, becoming a symbol of resilience and courage. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, had served as a mechanic during World War II, her hands dirty with engine oil, while bombs fell around her. Now, as he prepared to carry forward that legacy of service and remembrance, he felt the weight of history on his shoulders. Catherine, meanwhile, was reviewing the notes she had taken during her conversations with historians about the broader context of Mrs. Hartwell's story. She had learned that thousands of similar friendships had formed in the aftermath of war, former enemies who had found common ground in their shared humanity. These stories rarely made headlines, but they represented something profound about the human capacity for forgiveness and growth. The rain began to fall as they prepared to leave for their first appointment of the day, a visit to a veteran's home in East London. Neither William nor Catherine knew that this seemingly routine engagement would set in motion events that would transform their planned tribute from a private gesture into a moment that would resonate across the nation and beyond. The story of Harold Hartwell and Klaus Weber was about to become much more than a forgotten footnote in the history books. It was about to become a bridge between past and present, between remembrance and hope. The Sunshine Veterans Home in East London buzzed with an energy that staff hadn't seen in months. Word had spread quickly through the corridors that the Prince and Princess of Wales were coming for an unscheduled visit. And residents who rarely left their rooms were gathering in the main hall, their metals polished and their memories stirring. Among them sat 94-year-old Arthur Morrison, a DA veteran who had initially been reluctant to attend. His daughter had convinced him to join the others, as though Arthur's mind had been elsewhere since receiving an unexpected phone call the night before. The caller had identified himself as Thomas Weber, calling from Hamburg, Germany. The name Weber had struck Arthur like lightning. He remembered a Klaus Weber from somewhere deep in his past, though the details remained frustratingly unclear. When William and Catherine arrived at the home, they were greeted by director Sarah Chen, who had worked tirelessly to verify some of the stories that had begun surfacing since news of Mrs. Hartwell's letter had quietly spread through veteran communities. What had started as research into one family's secret had uncovered a network of similar stories, each one adding another thread to an extraordinary tapestry of post-war reconciliation. Catherine immediately gravitated toward Arthur Morrison, drawn by something she couldn't quite identify. As they spoke, Arthur's memories began to crystallize. He told her about a wounded German soldier he had helped during the chaos following D-Day, a young man who had been left behind by his retreating unit. Arthur had defied orders to get medical attention for the soldier, risking court-martial in the process. "I never knew what happened to him," Arthur said, his weathered hands trembling slightly. "Always wondered if he made it home." Klaus. His name was Klaus Weber. The connection was immediate and electric. Catherine felt her heart race as she realized they were witnessing something extraordinary unfolding in real time. Meanwhile, William was speaking with Margaret Foster, whose brother had served in Burma. Margaret had brought with her a wooden box containing items she had discovered while clearing out her brother's house after his death 6 months earlier. Among them was a small carved elephant, clearly Asian in origin, with German words inscribed on its base. Also in the box was a faded address in Bavaria and a photograph of her brother standing beside a man in civilian clothes, both smiling broadly. In what appeared to be a beer garden, the atmosphere in the room grew charged with emotion as more residents began sharing similar stories. There was Ronald Beatty, who had maintained a decades-long correspondence with an Italian soldier he had captured in North Africa. There was Dorothy Kensington, whose late husband had helped rebuild a German orphanage in the 1950s and had remained in contact with several of the children who had grown up there. Each story revealed another facet of a hidden history that had been quietly unfolding for decades, largely unnoticed by the wider world. William found himself deeply moved by what he was hearing. These weren't just stories about individual acts of kindness or forgiveness. They represented a deliberate choice to see beyond the uniforms and propaganda to the human beings underneath. He began to understand that Mrs. Hartwell's letter had opened a door to something much larger than anyone had anticipated. Catherine, meanwhile, had taken Arthur's phone number and promised to look into Thomas Weber's call. She had a feeling that the connections they were discovering weren't coincidental. As they prepared to leave the veterans' home, both William and Catherine knew that their planned tribute had evolved into something far more significant than they had originally envisioned. The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet, both of them processing what they had experienced. Catherine broke the silence first. "This is bigger than we thought," she said. "These stories aren't isolated incidents. There's a pattern here. A whole generation of people who chose reconciliation over revenge." William nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. "We need to document this properly," he said. "These people won't be with us much longer, and their stories deserve to be preserved." He paused, then added, "I think Mrs. Hartwell's letter was just the beginning." As they arrived back at the palace, Catherine immediately began making phone calls. She contacted historians at the Imperial War Museum, archivists at the National Army Museum, and researchers at universities across Europe. What she discovered over the next few hours would reshape their understanding of the post-war period and set the stage for a tribute that would touch hearts across the globe. By evening, their private secretary had received calls from Germany, Italy, France, and even Japan. Word was spreading through veteran communities across Europe about the British royals who were interested in stories of wartime reconciliation. Each call brought new stories, new connections, and new evidence of a hidden network of former enemies who had chosen friendship over hatred. The most significant call came just as William and Catherine were sitting down to dinner. Thomas Weber from Hamburg was on the line, and he had extraordinary news about Arthur Morrison. Not only had Klaus Weber survived the war, but he had spent years searching for the British soldier who had saved his life. Thomas was Klaus's grandson, and he had been trying to trace Arthur for months using information his grandfather had left him before his death the previous year. As Catherine listened to Thomas Weber's story, she realized that their tribute was no longer about remembering the past. It was about healing wounds that had been carried for generations and celebrating the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to transcend even the deepest divisions. The phone call with Thomas Weber lasted nearly 2 hours, and by its end, Catherine had filled 7 pages with notes. Klaus Weber's story was remarkable in its detail and scope. After being saved by Arthur Morrison on the beaches of Normandy, Klaus had spent months recovering in a British field hospital. During that time, he had learned English from the nurses and had developed a deep appreciation for the compassion shown to him by his former enemies. Upon returning to Germany after the war, Klaus had dedicated his life to rebuilding his shattered country while fostering reconciliation with the Allied nations. He had worked with refugee organizations, helped establish exchange programs between German and British schools, and spent decades quietly funding scholarships for young people to study abroad. But through it all, he had never stopped looking. For the British soldier who had risked everything to save his life, Thomas Weber had flown to London that very evening, carrying with him a leather satchel that had belonged to his grandfather. Inside were letters, photographs, and documents that told the story of Klaus Weber's lifelong search for Arthur Morrison. The most poignant item was a letter Klaus had written to Arthur but never sent, dated just 3 months before his death. In it, he had poured out his gratitude and described how that moment of mercy on the beach had shaped his entire worldview. When William and Catherine met Thomas at Kensington Palace late that night, they were struck by how much he resembled the young Klaus Weber in the wartime photographs. Thomas was an architect who had spent his career designing memorials and peace gardens across Europe. Continuing his grandfather's mission of reconciliation through his professional work, "My grandfather always said that Remembrance Day should be about more than mourning the dead," Thomas told them, his English accented but fluent. He believed it should celebrate the living and their capacity to choose love over hate, understanding over revenge. His words resonated deeply with both William and Catherine, who had been struggling to articulate exactly what their tribute should represent. As dawn broke over London on November 11th, the three of them had developed a plan that was both ambitious and deeply personal. They would proceed with the traditional ceremonies, but they would also host a special gathering at Westminster Abbey that evening. It's a service of reconciliation that would bring together the families whose stories had emerged over the past few days. Catherine had worked through the night, coordinating with contacts across Europe to locate relatives of the soldiers whose stories they had uncovered. The response was overwhelming. Margaret Foster's research had led to contact with the family of the Italian soldier her brother had befriended. They would be flying in from Rome that afternoon. Dorothy Kensington's story had connected with a German woman whose father had been one of the orphans helped by Dorothy's late husband. She was driving through the night from Berlin to attend. Most importantly, Arthur Morrison would finally meet the grandson of the man he had saved over 70 years ago. The 94-year-old veteran had been overwhelmed when Catherine called him with the news, and for several minutes he had been unable to speak. His daughter later told Catherine that it was the first time she'd seen her father cry since her mother's funeral. The morning's traditional ceremony at the cenotaph proceeded with its usual dignity and precision. William laid his wreath with particular solemnity, thinking about all the stories he had heard over the past few days. As he stood in silence during the 2-minute remembrance, His thoughts were not only with the fallen, but with those who had survived and chosen to build bridges rather than walls. Catherine, watching from the Foreign Office balcony, found herself scanning the crowd, wondering how many other untold stories were represented among the thousands of people gathered to remember. She thought about Mrs. Hartwell, who would be attending the evening service despite her advanced age and the long journey from Yorkshire. The elderly woman had become something of a hero to Catherine, her simple act of sharing her family's secret having unleashed this extraordinary chain of events. After the morning ceremony, William and Catherine returned to Westminster Abbey to oversee the final preparations for the evening service. The usually formal space had been transformed subtly, but meaningfully. Alongside the traditional Union Jacks were small flags from Germany, Italy, and other former enemy nations. The altar had been adorned with photographs and personal items, donated by the families who would be attending. Thomas Weber had spent the afternoon at the Abbey, working with the staff to create a display that told the story of the connections that had been discovered. Each exhibit included before and after photographs, images from wartime showing the participants in their uniforms, followed by pictures from their later lives showing them as friends, pen pals, and in some cases, even business partners. The most moving displays centered on Klaus Weber and Arthur Morrison. Thomas had brought his grandfather's journal from the war. It was open to a page where Klaus had written about the British soldier who had shown him mercy. Beside it was a photograph that Arthur's daughter had provided, showing her father in his uniform shortly after D-Day, young and earnest, with no idea how his simple act of compassion would ripple through the decades. As the sun set over London, guests began arriving at Westminster Abbey for what would become one of the most emotionally charged services in its 1,000-year history. These weren't dignitaries or officials. They were ordinary families carrying extraordinary stories of forgiveness and friendship that had transcended the deepest human conflicts. William and Catherine greeted each family personally, listening to their stories and marveling at the common threads that ran through them all. Each tale was unique in its details, but all shared the same fundamental message, that even in humanity's darkest hours, there remained the possibility of redemption, understanding, and love. The moment Arthur Morrison entered Westminster Abbey, supported by his walking frame and accompanied by his daughter, the atmosphere in the ancient church shifted palpably. The 94-year-old veteran moved slowly down the aisle, his medals catching the light from the stained glass windows, while Thomas Weber stood waiting near the altar, clutching his grandfather's wartime diary. Catherine watched from the side chapel as the two men approached each other. Arthur had studied the photographs Thomas had brought, memorizing every detail of Klaus Weber's face as a young soldier. Now, looking at Thomas, he could see the same gentle eyes, the same determined jawline that he remembered from that chaotic day on the beaches of Normandy. When they finally stood face to face, neither man spoke immediately. Arthur reached out with a trembling hand to touch Thomas's cheek, as if to confirm this moment was real. "You have his eyes," he whispered finally. "Your grandfather had the kindest eyes I ever saw in a soldier." What? Thomas pulled out a worn photograph from his jacket pocket, the same image Catherine had seen in the display, showing Klaus Weber as a young Wehrmacht soldier. "He carried a picture of you in his mind for 70 years, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "He described you perfectly to me when I was a child. The British soldier with the gentle hands who chose mercy over duty." The exchange was witnessed by dozens of other families, each carrying their own stories of connection across former battle lines. Maria Rossetti had traveled from Rome with her elderly father, Giacomo, who had corresponded with British soldier Ronald Beatty for over 50 years after their encounter in the North African desert. Helga Kaufmann had driven from Berlin with a suitcase full of Christmas cards and birthday greetings that her father had exchanged with Dorothy, Kensington's late husband, for 3 decades after he had helped rebuild their orphanage. William took his place at the lectern as the service began, but this would be unlike any address he had ever given. Instead of speaking about duty, sacrifice, or national pride, he found himself talking about the extraordinary, ordinary people gathered before him. He spoke about Mrs. Hartwell's courage in sharing her family's secret, about Arthur Morrison's choice to see humanity in an enemy soldier, and about Klaus Weber's lifetime dedication to building bridges instead of walls. "Today we remember not just those who fell," William said, his voice carrying clearly through the Abbey, "but those who chose to rise above the hatred that war breeds. We honor not just the ultimate sacrifice, but the ongoing sacrifice of choosing. Forgiveness over revenge, understanding over prejudice, and love over fear." Catherine had prepared remarks as well, but as she stood to speak, she found herself setting aside her prepared notes. Instead, she spoke directly from her heart about what the past few days had taught her about the true meaning of remembrance. She talked about the letters and photographs she had seen, about the friendships that had blossomed in the most unlikely circumstances, and about the ripple effects of small acts of kindness that had extended across generations. "These families have shown us that remembrance is not just about looking backward," she said. "It's about carrying forward the best of human nature, even when, especially when, it would be easier to carry forward the worst." The service included readings from letters exchanged between former enemies, hymns sung in multiple languages, and moments of silence that seemed to stretch beyond the traditional 2 minutes into something deeper and more profound. Mrs. Hartwell, despite her age and frailty, had insisted on reading aloud from one of the letters her father had received from Klaus Weber in 1962. On the anniversary of D-Day, the letter spoke of Klaus's recurring dream about the British soldier who had saved his life, and his hope that somehow, somewhere, that man knew that his act of mercy had planted seeds that had grown into a lifetime of service to others. As Mrs. Hartwell's voice, clear despite her 89 years, carried through the Abbey, there wasn't a dry eye in the congregation. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when Thomas Weber presented Arthur Morrison with his grandfather's wartime diary, open to the page where Klaus had written about his rescue. Arthur, his hands shaking, read aloud Klaus's words from that day. "Today, I learned that enemies are just people who have been told different stories about each other. The British soldier who saved me didn't see a German, he saw a human being who needed help." As the service drew to a close, something unexpected happened. The families began to approach each other, drawn by the shared experience of their stories. Children and grandchildren of former enemies embraced, exchanged contact information, and made plans to visit each other's countries. What had begun as a service of remembrance was transforming into something entirely new, a celebration of the human capacity for reconciliation and growth. The media, who had been invited to document the service, found themselves witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't just a royal event or a traditional ceremony. It was a genuine moment of healing that had emerged organically from the grassroots up. Camera operators wiped away tears as they filmed, and seasoned journalists struggled to find words adequate to describe what they were witnessing, as the last hymn was sung and the final prayers offered. William and Catherine stood together, watching. The families who had gathered that evening, they knew that what had started with a simple letter from Yorkshire had grown into something that would extend far beyond this single service, far beyond this single day of remembrance. The days following the Westminster Abbey service brought an avalanche of response that neither William nor Catherine had anticipated. Within 48 hours of the ceremony, the palace had received over 10,000 letters, emails, and phone calls from across the globe. Veterans organizations in 12 countries had reached out, each with similar stories of post-war reconciliation that had been quietly maintained for decades. Catherine found herself at the center of what was rapidly becoming an international movement. The Imperial War Museum had offered to create a permanent exhibition documenting the stories that were emerging. Publishers were expressing interest in a book that would collect these tales of forgiveness and friendship. Most significantly, the families themselves had begun organizing their own network, sharing contact information and planning visits across international borders. The story that captured the public imagination most powerfully was that of Arthur Morrison and Klaus Weber's grandson, Thomas. The image of the 94-year-old veteran embracing the young German architect had appeared on front pages across Europe and beyond. More importantly, their meeting had inspired others to come forward with similar stories that had remained hidden. In family archives for generations, one of the most remarkable responses came from Japan. Hiroshi Tanaka, a businessman from Osaka, contacted the palace after seeing coverage of the Westminster service on international news. His grandfather had been taken prisoner by Australian forces in the Pacific Theatre and had maintained a correspondence with his captor, Sergeant James Mackenzie. Until Mackenzie's death in 1989, Hiroshi had flown to London with a suitcase full of letters and was working with Catherine to locate Mackenzie's surviving family members in Brisbane. Similarly, family from Poland had reached out with documents showing how their grandfather, a resistance fighter, maintained contact with a German officer who had helped Jewish families escape the Warsaw Ghetto. The officer's grandson was a doctor in Munich, and the two families were planning to meet for the first time at a memorial service in Warsaw the following month. William had initially worried that the attention might overwhelm the elderly veterans and their families, but he discovered the opposite was true. Arthur Morrison, despite his advanced age, had become energized by the experience of finally connecting with Klaus Weber's family. He was working with Thomas to establish a scholarship fund for young people to study conflict resolution, using money that Klaus had left specifically for charitable purposes related to peace-building. Mrs. Hartwell, whose original letter had started the entire chain of events, had become something of a celebrity despite her shy nature. She had been invited to speak at schools, universities, and community centers about the importance of preserving family histories and sharing difficult truths about the past. Her simple message that ordinary people can choose extraordinary responses to hatred and division was resonating with audiences across the United Kingdom and beyond. The media coverage had also revealed the broader historical context of these individual stories. Historians were beginning to document what they were calling the silent reconciliation movement, a largely undocumented phenomenon of former enemies who had chosen friendship over hatred in the decades following World War II. Dr. Emma Richardson from Cambridge University had begun compiling a database of these relationships, which already included over 200 documented cases of lasting friendships between former adversaries. Catherine had become particularly invested in ensuring that the stories were properly preserved for future generations. She had commissioned a team of oral historians to begin recording interviews with the surviving veterans and their families. Time was of the essence. Many of the original participants were in their 90s or had already passed away, leaving only their children and grandchildren to carry forward their stories. The most moving development had been the decision by several of the families to formalize their connections through what they called friendship treaties, documents that committed their descendants to maintaining the bonds that had been forged by their ancestors. These weren't legal documents, but symbolic commitments to remembering the lessons their elders had learned about the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. Thomas Weber and Arthur Morrison had signed the first such treaty, with Thomas's young daughter and Arthur's great-grandson serving as witnesses. The document committed both families to meeting annually on November 11th to remember not only the war that had brought their grandfathers together, but the peace they had chosen to build in its aftermath. The international response had also caught the attention of diplomatic circles. Several ambassadors had approached the palace about incorporating the stories into official reconciliation programs between their countries. The German ambassador to the United Kingdom had proposed a formal exchange program that would bring together descendants of former enemies to work on joint peace-building projects. William found himself reflecting on how quickly the initiative had grown beyond anything he and Catherine had originally envisioned. What had started as a private tribute had become a movement that was touching lives across continents and generations. He began to understand that they had tapped into something fundamental about human nature, the deep desire to believe that reconciliation is possible, that hatred need not be permanent, and that even the most bitter enemies can become friends. The palace staff had initially struggled to manage the volume of responses, but Catherine had insisted that every letter be read and every story be acknowledged. She had personally replied to hundreds of messages, each one adding another thread to the growing tapestry of human connection and healing that was emerging from the shadows of history. As November drew to a close, William and Catherine began planning what would become an annual tradition, the reconciliation service. that would honor not just the war dead but the living legacy of peace-building that their sacrifice had made possible. 1 year later, as the first anniversary of what had become known as the Night of Reconciliation approached, Westminster Abbey was once again preparing for an extraordinary gathering. But this time, the event had grown far beyond anything William and Catherine could have imagined when they first read Mrs. Hartwell's letter. Over 500 families from 23 countries were expected to attend the service, each carrying stories of former enemies who had chosen friendship. The original group had grown into an international network called the Bridge Builders, coordinated by a foundation that Thomas Weber and Arthur Morrison had established with Catherine's help. But despite being 95 years old, Arthur had insisted on traveling to London again, this time accompanied not just by his daughter, but by Klaus Weber's great-granddaughter, who had flown in from Berlin. The impact of that first service had rippled outward in ways none of them could have predicted. Schools across Europe had begun teaching about the reconciliation stories as part of their history curricula. The letters between Klaus Weber and Harold Hartwell had been published in a book that had become a bestseller in 7 languages. Most importantly, the elderly veterans who had attended the first service had inspired their own communities too. Seek out similar stories, creating a grassroots movement that was spreading across the globe. Mrs. Hartwell, now 90 years old but still sharp and determined, had become an unlikely international figure. She had spoken at the United Nations about the power of ordinary people to choose reconciliation over revenge. Her message was simple but profound. We all have the power to write better endings to our stories, no matter how dark the beginning. Catherine had spent the year documenting the expanding network of connections, the Imperial War Museums. Exhibition had become so popular that traveling versions had been created for museums in 12 countries. More than 2,000 previously unknown reconciliation stories had been discovered and documented, creating an archive that historians were calling one of the most important collections of primary source material about post-war healing ever assembled. Perhaps most remarkably, the movement had inspired contemporary reconciliation efforts. Veterans from more recent conflicts in the Balkans, the Middle East, and elsewhere had begun reaching out to former enemies, using the World War II stories as models for their own healing processes. A support network had been established to help these modern veterans navigate the complex process of reaching across divides that often seemed insurmountable. The second annual service at Westminster Abbey was being broadcast live to audiences around the world. Like the previous year's intimate gathering, this had become a global event. But William and Catherine had insisted on maintaining its personal, grassroots character. The ceremony would still center on individual stories and personal testimonies rather than grand speeches or political statements. The most poignant addition to this year's service was the memory garden that had been created in the Abbey's courtyard. Each participating family had contributed a stone engraved with the names of their ancestors who had chosen reconciliation over revenge. The garden had become a place of pilgrimage for visitors from around the world who wanted to reflect on the possibility of healing historical wounds. Thomas Weber had relocated to London permanently, now taking a position with the International Peacebuilding, an organization that had been inspired by his grandfather's story. He and Arthur Morrison had become inseparable, with Thomas visiting the elderly veteran several times a week to record his memories and help him respond to the hundreds of letters he received from people inspired by his story. The most surprising development had been the discovery that the reconciliation phenomenon was still ongoing. Contemporary conflicts were producing their own quiet stories of healing and friendship. Syrian refugees were finding common ground with aid workers from countries that had bombed their homeland. Veterans from opposing sides in the Falklands War had begun corresponding after hearing about the World War II friendships. Israeli and Palestinian families were reaching out to each other, using the documented reconciliation stories as roadmaps for their own difficult journeys toward understanding. Catherine had received a letter that morning from a young woman in Rwanda, a survivor of the genocide who had been inspired by the British reconciliation stories to reach out to the daughter of one of the perpetrators. Their correspondence had led to a meeting, and eventually to collaborative work on memorial projects in their community. Your grandmother's courage in sharing her family's secret has given me the courage to try to heal my own family's wounds." The woman had written, as the second annual service began. William found himself looking out at a congregation that represented something unprecedented in human history, a living demonstration that the deepest wounds could be healed, that the most bitter enemies could become friends, and that the choice between hatred and love remained available to every person. In every generation, regardless of the circumstances they had inherited, Arthur Morrison, supported by Thomas Weber and surrounded by 3 generations of both families, served as the evening's keynote speaker. His voice was weaker than it had been a year ago, but his message was stronger. "Klaus Weber and I didn't end the war," he said, his words carrying clearly through the packed abbey. "We just refused to let the war end us. That choice is still available to every person in this room and everyone listening around the world." As silence fell over Westminster Abbey for the final 2-minute remembrance, it wasn't just the traditional silence of mourning for the dead. It was a living silence, pregnant with possibility, filled with the breathing presence of hundreds of people who had chosen to believe that reconciliation was possible, that forgiveness could triumph over hatred, and that ordinary people could write extraordinary endings to the darkest chapters of human history. In that silence, Catherine thought about Mrs. Hartwell's letter, now framed and hanging in her private study at Kensington Palace. A simple act of sharing a family's secret had unleashed a movement that was still growing, still healing, still proving that the most powerful force in human history might not be the capacity for destruction, but the capacity for redemption. The tribute that had stirred a nation had become something even more remarkable, a testament to the enduring power of hope.